Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to talk about the newest album from Danny Brown called You Know What I'm Saying. In his series, Whatever Happened to Alternative Nation, music critic Stephen Hyden once identified Alice in Chains' sophomore album, Dirt, as an unrelentingly grim collection of songs about how people should never ever shoot heroin. And you know what? He's not wrong. That album, for as potent as it is, might be one of the most nightmarish grunge albums ever made that describes the form of drug addiction in utterly harrowing terms. And in 2016, Danny Brown followed that tradition with Atrocity Exhibition. His previous two projects might have reinforced the garish juxtaposition between how much escapist fun drugs could be opposite the grimy, poverty-stricken life he was trying to escape, but Atrocity Exhibition, it went further, embracing a howling nightmare of experimental production and wild delivery that was looking to drag you into the roots of how horrifying addiction and the underlying depression could really be. It's not an album that I precisely love. Tonally, it's all over the place and not all the experimentation and the production sticks the landing, but there hasn't really been anything like it in the 2010s in hip-hop, and it absolutely set a high watermark for Danny Brown as a rapper and an artist, because I've never really been a huge fan before, but Atrocity Exhibition, it definitely brought me on board in a very big way. It's deservingly so one of the best albums of 2016. But flash forward to 2019, and Danny Brown seems to be in a very different place. He's older, a little bit more restrained and cleaned up. He's got a pretty good show on Viceland that might have its weird moments, but really isn't embracing the shock in the same way that his albums have. And thus, I didn't really expect him to go further down the rabbit hole on his newest project, You Know What I'm Saying. I mean, sure, names like JPEG Mafia and Run the Jewels and Thundercat and Blood Orange attached to the production, it did suggest this was going to be kind of weird, but likely a more controlled, focused brand of weird. Still, I was fascinated to see where Danny Brown would ultimately land with this, and it was kind of hard not to be excited about that set of collaborators, so okay, what do we get on You Know What I'm Saying? This is the sort of project that I really wish I could say I like more than I do. Hell, I wish I could say more about it as a whole, but by about a half dozen listens through You Know What I'm Saying, I was left with the feeling that it inhabits a pretty rigidly traditional and old school space in hip-hop, and one that doesn't really demand a lot of deeper analysis in the same way that previous Danny Brown albums really have. Don't get me wrong, I don't think this is a bad album. It's well structured. Danny Brown has a lot of command over his production. He is a great rapper, and some of that production can be pretty interesting, and the guest appearances, they're all solid, but coming from his last few projects, it's hard not to hear You Know What I'm Saying as a bit of a lesser entry. A little reminiscent of the come down that Crash Talk was for Schoolboy Q, except where he embraced mainstream conventionality to simplify. Danny Brown finds a niche that could have been imported straight from the weirder side of rap between 1986 and 93, and a huge part of this starts with Danny Brown himself. Now, as someone who got accustomed to his nasal, fast-paced yelp very quickly and appreciated the balance between unbridled energy and downbeat lyricism that colored his previous work, I wouldn't really ask him to tone things down, which he absolutely does here. And not just with his vocal timbre, but his cadence structure as well. The flows are slower, the structure is simpler and stiffer and defiantly backwards looking. And while critics have said it's been done so you can catch everything he will say in his bars, I honestly think that's being charitable to a more basic style that hip-hop evolved away from around the time that I was born. And look, nothing is wrong with embracing elements of hip-hop's past and paying tribute, but if you're going for that sort of less sophisticated flow nowadays, especially as you're toning back your delivery, I think there is a fair expectation that the wordplay or the lyrical detail or the subtext or the insight will come through in order to augment it, especially given how capable Danny Brown can be of that on even wilder sounds and flows. And I'll be blunt, I'm just not hearing that with a lot of the content here either. A lot of which feels rather par for the course that we would expect from Danny Brown, and not really in a way that's subversive or particularly shocking. I've heard some people say that Danny Brown's rougher embrace of sex and drugs would be out of place, calling back to a relatively clean age of hip-hop, especially in comparison with the gangster rap that would eventually follow and take over. But on songs like Dirty Laundry, he's referencing songs like the Humpty Dance from Digital Underground from 19 1990, and really, that could be just as raunchy if you're paying attention to the details. Or you know what, maybe you could see some subtext on how you can talk about this sort of subject matter while still remaining lyrical or old school. That would fit in with the decent Run the Jewels feature and how on Theme Song and Savage Nomad he disparages the younger kids who might be just as flashy now but could never match him and didn't live that life. And you know what, El? I might even agree with him there. But when that becomes the extent of the broader subversion, the deeper that I dig into the writing, when you realize that more focus was placed on tight individual songs, because that's really how it was in the single-driven era of old school hip-hop, it leaves the composite album feeling a little bit less than the sum of its parts. Yeah, the storytelling behind some of his more wild sexual encounters on Dirty Laundry, it is colorful and pretty funny, as is the flamboyant flexing on Negro Spiritual, even if we didn't get a JPEG Mafia verse, and LP and Killer Mike land a couple solid punchlines on 3 Tiers, although I had to look askance at that Ike and Tina reference from Mike though. It did come together, but did catch a second glance, and I do like how thankful Danny Brown sounds on Best Life for leaving all that grisly detail behind him, even if by Shine and Combat, you get the impression it's an uneasy security that he now has. But hell, Belly of the Beast is utterly absurd with some of his sex references, especially on that first verse, but that first verse was built off an identical freestyle he put out in 2013, and it's kind of telling that it's not that far removed from the lyrical structures he otherwise has here. And then there's Shine, which probably has my favorite groove here along with Blood Orange, but Danny Brown had to throw in the line, losing all in a second, like me too, which given the downbeat context not only feels weirdly sympathetic to those guys, it also doesn't even tend to be all that accurate, given how quickly some of the more famous canceled ones tend to rebound and then get re-accepted again. Not a one-time thing that Danny Brown seems to reference, like that divorced widow line on Combat 2. Kinda disappointing, I gotta be honest there, just feels a little lacking in insight. But you know what, fine. The album's not as deep or as thematically rich as previous Danny Brown projects. At least the production will be strange and offbeat and insanely colorful, right? Well, not exactly. A lot of attention was shown on production credits from Paul White and JPEG Mafia, and even Thundercat and Flying Lotus, but more than a few credits and the executive producer credit go to Q-Tip, who seems to have arranged for Danny Brown to get some of his most steady underlying compositions. Now in theory, this isn't really a bad thing. Paul White has produced one of my favorite hip-hop albums of this decade with Open Mike Ego on Hella Personal Film Festival, and those beats weren't all that out there, and his sample palette, not that far removed either, and a more steady groove, hell, it might not be a bad thing to steady JPEG Mafia's hand either, but I gotta be blunt, I'm not really wowed by many of the actual tunes we did get. The gentle patter of the groove opposite the creaking strings and flutters on Theme Song, the warping funk gurgles and beeping that sounds like they're playing off a kazoo on Dirty Laundry, the tinny melodic loops, the spare bass drums, and the enveloping swallow of the vocal sample on Belly of the Beast, the contorted guitar squeals and the scratching opposite Savage Nomad, and then you get the more tense bass and guitar interplay on Negro Spiritual, and the very elegant Tommy McGee sample flip on Best Life. These are all solid. I like all of these, and the groove behind Shine, again, probably the best one here, but they aren't really produced to have a ton of flair, with slower percussion and even vocal leads that aren't exactly mastered to have the same crunch or presence, where you can tell his vocals are actually clipping some of the edges of the mix on some songs. Now with Danny Brown's voice being so dynamic, he will cut through anything regardless, but I'm still left with the feeling that this particular brand of slightly muffled, lo-fi blending is dampening the impact and doesn't really match Danny Brown's style. Hell, even though the title track was produced by Paul White, the cadence of that dance groove, it really sounds a lot more fitting for Q-Tip, just with warping drum pickups, and I gotta admit, that was a little distracting. And thus at the end, folks, I really wanted to like this. I really did, but at the end, I'm just a lot more lukewarm on this direction and sound for Danny Brown, where it feels like across the board, a step was taken back to make this more reserved and less interesting. That's not expecting this to replicate Triple X or Atrocity Exhibition. In the latter case, given where Danny Brown is now, that wouldn't even make sense. But for as comfortable as this lane can feel for him now, being a little more mature, it's not really one that plays to his strengths as an artist or feels all that experimental. And given that I found precious few standouts on this, yeah, for me it's a very strong 6 out of 10 and only really recommended for the die-hard fans. It's not a bad listen, especially if you're a fan of old school hip-hop, but otherwise, yeah, just temper some of your expectations. That's all I'm saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Again, my throat's still a little bit sore, so you can explain why this is coming out a little bit more reserved here. Still wanted to like this a lot more too. But if you want to buy or stream it, links down in the description below. And I got the poll up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys are looking for the newest episode of Billboard Breakdown or other reviews, links are in the card right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.